So the European election results are coming in, and it seems as if the parties that campaigned against immigration and for the preservation of cultural and national identity are the ones who did best, while the biggest losers are the parties that campaigned for leftist policy ideas such as open borders, immigration, and so forth. Now, this ties up very well with some observations we can make about the recent South African elections. In fact, I would go as far as to say that the most important thing that we can learn from the 2024 South African elections, the most important observation that we ought to make, is also the one that we hear people talk about the least. And I think I know why this is the case. It's because a lot of the analysts who are talking about the election have their own ideological predispositions, and that this observation doesn't fit with their ideological views, as a result of which we don't hear them talking about this. Now, before I get to what this is, just allow me to make one or two quick remarks about democracy, the state of democracy, and what it is supposed to be, or how we think about democracy. Democracy is, of course, something that has come down from antiquity. The Greeks had some form of democracy, the Romans, and so forth. But during the Enlightenment in particular, we have started to change our way of thinking about democracy. And this is especially evident in the works of people like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, all of which have argued in some way or another that we need to make a shift from natural democracy to artificial democracy, or a natural form of government to an artificial form of government. Now, each of these three in particular approached it in a different way with different arguments about the state of nature and so forth, and we don't need to get into that now. But they did agree that what is needed for progress is a system of government that is not natural but artificial, in which man or people are not in the state of nature or not in their natural state, but where they are governed by a structure that was created by man, which is artificial much more than natural. Now, we can talk about what that really means. What's the difference between natural and artificial? But there is a very important difference between what we might describe as natural democracy and artificial democracy. Now, when we talk about natural and artificial, we essentially mean with natural something that sprouts naturally from who we are. When we say artificial, we mean it's something that we created that isn't necessarily natural. Now, a very good example of democracy that is natural is simply a community that have a lot of things in common, that share the same culture, traditions, language, religion, and so forth, that get together and that decide who their leaders are. This is perfectly natural. An artificial form of democracy is different communities coming together, of which some are bigger than others, and then having these communities vote who their leaders are as if they are only individuals and as if they are not also members of different communities. There's that old saying by Winston Churchill that democracy is two wolves and a lamb voting on what is for dinner. Now, it's perfectly natural for wolves, if we might force this metaphor, to come together to decide who their leaders are, and it's perfectly natural for sheep or lambs to vote who their leaders are, but it's not really natural for wolves and sheep to get together to vote who their leaders are, especially when wolves are in a majority. And so this is what democracy has become. Why? Because democracy as we know it today has become a very particular definition of democracy, which only recognizes us on two levels: an individual and a citizen of the state. You are an individual with individual rights in a liberal democracy, and you are a citizen of the state. So in the South African context, you are a South African. The American context, you are an American. But what happens when we have other communal identities that are not recognized by this system of government, such as cultural identities? Now, this is easier to deal with in countries that are much more homogeneous, when almost everyone in the country looks the same, thinks the same, have the same culture, religion, and so forth. But the more a country becomes diverse, the more issues like this lead to friction, which is what we are seeing in America and in Europe, especially Western Europe, and what we are seeing now in South Africa as well. And so think tanks such as Freedom House and the Economist Intelligence Unit have been warning us that democracy is on the retreat. According to the Economist Intelligence Unit, democracy is now in the worst state it has been since 2006, when they started measuring the state of democracy across the world. But of course, we must be meticulous and recognize that when the Economist Intelligence Unit says this, they have a very particular definition of democracy in mind. So, for example, when Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, said a few years ago in Transylvania that he prefers an illiberal democracy, he was almost universally attacked for being anti-democratic, when what he said in fact was that he prefers democracy, but he prefers a different conception of democracy. And I'm not his spokesperson, but more or less something along the lines of a democracy that recognizes a religion, that recognizes the family, cultural heritage, tradition, and so forth, where the type of democracy that we know today, as I mentioned, only recognizes you as an individual with individual rights and as a citizen of the state. And in as far as it does recognize you as part of a cultural community, as is the case in South Africa, it recognizes your individual right to choose the culture in which you want to participate. It doesn't recognize the existence of the cultural community as such, or the right of the cultural community to exist. Now let's get to the South African elections. It's very striking to categorize the biggest parties and to see who were the biggest winners and who were the biggest losers, and what are the common variables between these. Now I'm only looking at the 8 biggest parties, the 4 biggest winners and the 4 biggest losers, because there are many parties in South Africa that have received less than 1% support. And when I talk about winners or losers, I talk about votes, getting more or less votes. Now remember, as I mentioned in an earlier video, there was a dramatic drop in voter turnout in South Africa, which means, for example, that the DA has gotten a higher percentage in this past election, even though they have actually lost votes. There are some common threads, and one common thread in particular between all of these parties. And so let's get to that. So let's start by looking at the parties that lost the most votes. Here we can see the 4 different parties. Number 1, the African National Congress, or the ANC, that dropped from 10,026,475 in 2019 to 6,459,684 in this election. So almost a 4 million drop. The DA has dropped from 3,622,531 to 305,735. The EFF has dropped from 1,882,480 to 1,529,961. And the Freedom Front Plus has dropped from 414,864 to 218,850. Now, what can we identify as a common thread among all of these parties? There is indeed a common thread, which is that all of these parties campaigned on ideology, or we might say, with reference to my description earlier, something that is more akin to an artificial type of democracy. The ANC and the DA has been campaigning on what you might call South Africanism, the idea that we are first and foremost South Africa, and we need a government that seeks to achieve what is best for South Africa, which is of course something that is very hard to disagree with. The EFF has its own blend of ideology, not so much South Africanism, but more Africanism, in the sense that they have been campaigning for what is in the interest of black people and the African continent as a whole, as if there are not cultural differences between African people, between black people on the African continent. The EFF has very much campaigned on the notion of anti-white hatred and uniting black people because they are black. And then the Freedom Front, of course, which is a smaller party, has dropped quite significantly, especially if you consider it in terms of percentages. The Freedom Front has always been regarded as the Afrikaner party, a party that is primarily Afrikaans and that has a particular focus on the Afrikaner community. But over the last 5 years and the last 2 years especially, the Freedom Front has started making a shift from having an Afrikaner focus to having a minority focus. So campaigning for the rights of minority communities because they are minorities, almost as if, and I'm forcing it a bit, all minorities are the same, or all minorities have the same interests at heart. And of course, they lost support. Now, obviously, there are many other reasons why these parties have lost support. The ANC have had corruption issues, there's leadership issues, and so forth. But it's very striking to see that all of these parties have campaigned on ideology. Now, why is this important? It is especially important if we consider the parties that actually grew or did better in the last election, and what are the common threads between these. Now, here we can see the parties that grew, and I included MK or Mkhonto we Sizwe, even though this was the first time they participated in an election, simply due to the fact that they did extremely well. They are now one of the biggest parties in South Africa, having been founded less than a year before the election. So Mkhonto we Sizwe didn't campaign in the last election, but in this election, they had 2,344,309 votes. The IFP had 588,839 votes in the last election, and they went up to 618,207 votes. The PA, the Patriotic Alliance, is percentage-wise the biggest winner. They went up from 6,660 to 330,425. And then the UDM, the United Democratic Movement, went up from 78,030 to 78,484. Just barely, but there was an increase in voters. Now, having said that, what the biggest losers have in common is that they campaigned on the basis of ideology, or we can even say national identity, which is different from national identity in the European context, because South Africa is more like Europe than it is like a particular country in Europe, in the sense that South Africa is a big country with a wide variety of cultural identities. We can now ask the question, what is the common thread between the parties that did better? And it's very obvious looking at this list. In each of these cases, they had a focus on both cultural and regional identity. Mkhonto we Sizwe is very much known as a Zulu party, even though the party is built around the, you might say, personality cult of Jacob Zuma. It's very clear that the party has a Zulu identity. And the same goes for the IFP, even though there are some differences between them. MK is built more around the brand of Jacob Zuma, while the IFP is more built around the Nkonyama Trust and the Zulu royal family. But it's very clear, looking also at the electoral maps, that MK and IFP did so well because they got the support of the Zulu people, who voted for them because they are catering for the Zulu people. The same could be said about the Patriotic Alliance, that has a very distinct coloured Western Cape focus. Now, in some countries, people don't say coloured, they say mixed race or brown or something to that effect. In South Africa, we use the term coloured. But the coloured community in South Africa is not just a racial group. It has become a very distinct cultural community with its own culture. It's its own unique way of thinking about things. And the Patriotic Alliance zoomed in on that. They focused on the coloured community and the Western Cape, of course, where a significant proportion of the coloured community lives. And so Gayton McKenzie, the leader of the Patriotic Alliance, famously said during the elections, "Forget the rhino, save the brain-o," or "Forget the rhino, save the coloured guy." And as a result of this, we can see that he has grown dramatically in terms of support. And the same could be said for the UDM, even though they only slightly grew. The UDM has more of a Xhosa focus in the Eastern Cape. And so knowing what the UDM is, where they stand for, and where their focus is, it was easier for people to vote for them. And so, as I said, many analysts prefer not to talk about this or haven't even noticed this phenomenon. Some have and expressed their concerns about this, and also some political parties, especially those who campaign on ideology, have expressed their concern about the fact that people are voting along identity lines. Now, you can be angry about the fact that people vote along identity lines, but that doesn't change the fact that it is a fact of nature. It is a very ancient truth going back to Athens, when Aristotle said man is by nature a political animal. And when Aristotle said that, he didn't mean that man is by nature an individual that wants to vote for a party that is going to represent him in a system that he doesn't really associate with on the basis of ideology or theoretical conceptions. He meant that people by nature or by natural inclination associate with the things that are closest and dearest to them. People by nature have an affinity for their families. they have an affinity for their communities, the communities of which they form part, which of course includes your cultural community and your regional community, which is usually the same thing, or with regard to which there usually is a significant overlap. Now, in as far as the modern conception of democracy does not recognize this, it's obvious that there would be a backlash against this conception of democracy. So if we wish to save or preserve democracy, we need to start making the shift away from this conception of democracy that only recognizes you as an individual and a citizen of the state, towards a type of democracy that recognizes you as having a distinct identity with regard to which it's perfectly natural and even good for you to associate with, where it's not condemnable or controversial or questionable to want to promote the interests of your community, but where you have ample room to do that, and where doing that is not regarded as a threat or a bad thing.